There are moments when you look at the world around you and just know there's more to the story than meets the eye. That feeling? That's the heart of Ethical Root. We're the podcast dedicated to thoughtfully exploring the historical forces and philosophical ideas that truly shape how we live, how we manage our resources, and how we forge connections in our communities. If you're a curious soul drawn to history, ethical finance, or building a sustainable future, we're so glad you're here. In this very first episode, titled The Housing Paradox, Empty Factories and Displaced Families, we're shining a light on a stark reality, the puzzling sight of vacant industrial buildings across our cities, happening right alongside the heartbreaking displacement of generational families. It's a contradiction that begs for deeper understanding, revealing profound systemic issues. And we're committed to exploring why these spaces sit idle while so many need a place to call home. Together, we'll uncover the inspiring practices of an urban ecovillage, dissect the frameworks that make affordable housing projects genuinely successful, and embark on a sweeping journey through the history of economic thought, from the wisdom of ancient philosophers to the insights of modern minds, always connecting the grand theories back to our lived experiences. Guiding you through this crucial conversation are our brilliant hosts, Marcus Thorne, whose rich background in economic history and urban studies provides essential context, and Naomi Kincaid, an insightful voice in social ethics and sustainable community development. It's time to lean in. Take a listen now. Here's their conversation.
Today, you're with us for something, well, particularly special, actually.
Yes.
We're launching an entirely new initiative within our world of exploration, Ethical Root.
Right. And Ethical Root is, it's our new space, really, a place to explore the very foundations of how we live, how we save.
How we connect.
Exactly. How we connect within our communities and, the broader world.
It's about understanding those deep currents shaping our societal structures, isn't it?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the ethical implications woven right into them. We want to go beyond just the surface level, get to the very bedrock of these complex issues.
Understand the foundations.
The foundational principles at play, yes.
That's it. And to really dig into that, Ethical Root is going to be built around 3 core pillars. We'll be exploring these in a lot more detail in future deep dives.
Yeah.
Those pillars are affordable housing, financial independence, and sustainable living.
Key areas.
Yeah.
Interconnected ones.
Absolutely. These aren't just buzzwords, believe me. They're interconnected challenges, opportunities too, that really define modern life.
They touch everything.
Everything. Our homes, what we consume, the economic systems we navigate every single day.
Indeed. And our mission today for this first exploration is to tackle a really stark, real-world contradiction. Something many of us see right in our cities.
What's that?
Well, it's this puzzling rise of vacant industrial spaces, old factories, warehouses right in downtown areas.
Okay, I've seen that.
Right. And this is happening at the same time as the displacement of generational families who have deep roots in these very communities.
So empty buildings, people pushed out.
That's the tension. It plays out visibly right before our eyes, but the reasons why are often, they're obscured.
It's a paradox, isn't it? Empty spaces, perfectly good structures just sitting there, idle. And on the other hand, people are struggling to stay in their homes, losing their community connections.
It really is.
So for this deep dive, you've provided us with a fascinating set of sources. We've got a detailed study on an urban eco-village,
A very practical example.
a review focused on sustainable, affordable housing criteria,
More analytical.
and a really sweeping history of economic ideas.
Yeah.
Big picture stuff.
That provides the deeper context, yes.
And our mission, as always, is to help you understand what's most important here. See the connections between these different perspectives.
Connect the dots.
Exactly. And maybe get some aha moments about why this contradiction exists and how different lenses, especially economic ones, can illuminate it.
We'll be looking for insights into the underlying mechanisms.
And the historical perspectives, too.
Definitely. The historical perspectives that contribute to this urban tension. We want to offer you a multifaceted understanding, something beyond just the surface observation.
Sounds good. It feels like it's not just about supply and demand.
Oh, it's much deeper than that. It's about how our very ideas of value, property, and, progress have evolved over time.
And how those ideas show up in our cities.
Precisely, how they manifest in our built environment and the social fabric of our communities.
Okay, let's start by pulling back the curtain on that first source, the one giving us this really detailed, almost granular look into daily life in an urban eco-village.
Right.
It strikes me as a powerful, tangible example of a community actively shaping its own living environment, really pushing back against typical urban sprawl and consumption patterns.
It is. It's not just a group of people living near each other. It's a conscious statement about an alternative way of being right there in the city.
A lived experiment.
Exactly. And what's truly fascinating is how the villagers embody this live simply worldview. It's a direct contrast to the dominant consumer culture all around them.
It's not just talk.
Not at all. It's a practical, lived experiment in sustainability, right in an urban setting. They're physically demonstrating what it means to be stewards of the land, even when surrounded by concrete and exhaust.
Proving a different way is possible.
That's the idea. They believe a different kind of urban existence is possible.
And their daily rhythms really show that philosophy in action. The source paints such a vivid picture.
It does.
Afternoons and early evenings are apparently bustling. People coming back from jobs or maybe long bike journeys.
Commuting sustainably.
Right. And the wood shop is almost always open. Sounds like a real hub of activity.
It is. Very active, very collaborative, quite different from the often isolated experience many people have in cities.
We hear about specific people, too, like Ralph, who's making these non-electric wooden fruit dryers.
Using just solar heat and air.
Simple, ingenious, just using natural resources right there.
And then there's Huck and a crew building those icosahedral huts.
Yes, from cardboard plastics, other city waste.
Incredible resourcefulness. It's beyond just recycling. It's radically repurposing what society throws away into actual living spaces.
Turning trash into shelter.
Literally. And this ingenuity, it extends beyond just the physical stuff. There's another villager, Ears.
Right, working on the sustainability sunflower wheel.
Backed by plywood, yeah. Providing practical information on sustainable living. It's like a living, breathing educational tool for anyone who visits or passes by.
And Emily, a co-owner, writing and directing a play.
About sustainability, yes. To take to an eco-fair, with half the villagers rehearsing their parts.
So it's holistic building, educating, art.
Exactly. It shows their commitment extends to artistic expression, public education, community engagement. And this collaborative energy, this banter, apparently goes on quite late, maybe 10 p.m.
Before people finally call it a night.
It's a model of constant engagement, shared purpose. Nearly every action seems intentionally aligned with their values, prioritizing community and environment over, say, individual accumulation.
But they can't completely wall themselves off from the city, can they?
No, not at all. And the source points this out quite clearly.
Like that daily choice between driving to work, which is convenient, versus riding bikes through the sprawl, breathing exhaust fumes.
That's a real daily friction, isn't it, between their ideals and the existing urban infrastructure they're trying to reclaim.
It's a constant reminder of the dominant culture's impact and the genuine effort it takes to live differently. You have to actively choose it every day.
And this commitment they have as stewards of the land.
Yes, that profoundly influences their consumption habits. It pushes them to actively minimize their footprint.
So, gardening, obviously, but also gleaning fruit.
Right, from local trees where it would otherwise just rot, and even dumpster diving for old bread from bakeries.
Wow.
They meticulously reuse waste materials for everyday items, backpacks, shelters.
They actively resist buying new things from stores.
Actively, almost defiantly resist retail consumption. It's not just about being frugal, it's a deep philosophical and practical stand against the consumer ideology that they believe is destroying the environment. They're redefining value outside the market.
Exactly. Redefining value and utility outside of market norms. And that's such a stark contrast, isn't it, to the idea of empty factories sitting idle because they don't generate enough market value.
Even if they have huge potential social value.
Precisely. It makes you wonder how many resources sit unused simply because they don't fit into that narrow economic definition of profitability.
So we see their internal world, their practices. How do they interact with the outside world? Because it sounds like they aren't just trying to live this way themselves. They want to spread the message.
That's right. They do.
How do they manage that? How do they bridge that gap without compromising their core values, especially when the outside world operates on such, well, different principles?
That's a key question, and it touches on integration versus compromise, something many alternative communities grapple with.
Right.
What they do, interestingly, is strategically use conventional tools to spread their unconventional ideals. It creates this intriguing tension, almost a kind of calculated subversion. Well, Emily's statement to a local newspaper is revealing. She said, "It was an opportunity to sing to a different choir."
Intentional outreach.
Very intentional. They knew they needed to reach people outside their immediate circle using platforms those people already pay attention to.
And they went big, appearing on a national TV show.
They did, displaying the village as a model to the whole nation. The source does mention some internal divisions on this apathy from some, excitement from others.
But no outright disapproval.
No, apparently not. In fact, most residents actually took part in filming a scene showing a potluck in their community center.
Presenting that communal, almost family-like aspect to millions.
And the irony here is pretty powerful, isn't it?
Using TV?
Using television, which the source explicitly calls a primary tool for advertisers that pushes the very consumer ideology they think is so destructive.
They use it to their advantage.
Exactly. Leveraged its reach to raise awareness of their movement, their model. It's not a pure rejection of the system. It's a calculated use of its tools.
Demonstrates some adaptability.
Very adaptive intelligence, I'd say. It shows that even within a counterculture, pragmatism can be a powerful ally. You can critique a system while still sometimes strategically using its channels.
Okay, but here's another paradox, maybe. They're fiercely self-reliant in their consumption, reusing everything. Yet the source points out this tension. Many villagers rely on social services like food stamps, city food boxes.
Yes, that's noted.
That seems, at first glance anyway, to contradict their self-reliance vision, especially since they admit they lack space for all their provision.
Right, it seems like a contradiction.
How do they square that?
It's a very nuanced point, actually, and it's consistent with what they call their interdependence ideology.
Interdependence, not independence.
Exactly. They don't see using these services as a failure of self-reliance. They see it as a way to minimize their need for money, and that slightly frees them from having to do as much traditional wage labor.
Ah, okay, it's a trade-off.
It's an acknowledgement that in a complex urban environment, complete autonomy from the larger economic system is almost impossible. So rather than fight it head-on in every respect, they integrate strategically.
Like the example of the young woman.
Right. She trades 3 hours of work a day in the village for her tent space.
Okay.
And then works maybe 1 or 2 hours a week as an acupuncturist for actual wages.
So blend.
A blended model of subsistence within the community and some traditional work. It shows how self-reliance can be redefined to include reliance on the community and even existing social safety nets, not just rugged individualism.
Challenges our usual definition of independence.
It really does, especially in a modern urban society.
It's clear, though, that they face some big challenges just trying to exist day to day. What are the external forces pushing against their model? What threatens them?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture urban development, policy, their struggles really highlight the systemic constraints on alternative living models like this.
It's not easy.
Far from it. Their way of life is often threatened by insecure financial situations. That reflects how the instability in the broader economic system impacts even those trying to partially opt out.
They're on the fringes?
Exactly, operating on the fringes. And that precariousness is a constant battle. It forces them to be incredibly adaptable, incredibly resourceful.
And you mentioned the lack of space earlier.
Yes, the lack of geographical space. The source is clear. This limits their ability to maintain provisions, like growing enough food or storing enough water.
Which directly challenges that self-reliance vision in the city.
It does. In a dense urban setting, land is at an absolute premium, and that directly impacts their ability to truly insulate themselves from external market forces. They might want a bigger garden, but where do you find that land without paying exorbitant amounts?
Impossible for most.
Pretty much. And then there's the constant threat of bureaucrats shutting down their operations.
Regulatory hurdles.
Yes, administrative and regulatory hurdles. They often exist in a kind of gray area outside conventional zoning, maybe not meeting standard building codes.
So pressure from the city.
Constant pressure from municipal regulations. That's a significant constraint. But despite all these problems, they do find ways to thrive. By using those local newspapers, the national TV shows we mentioned, community networks, getting support where they can, it shows incredible resilience.
And strategic engagement.
Strategic engagement with the dominant culture, yes. Not outright rejection. They're finding ways to navigate, sometimes even leverage the existing system to sustain their alternative vision.
So the Ecovillage shows this incredible ingenuity against all these urban constraints. How does their struggle for space and resources, right there in the city, how does that contrast with those empty industrial zones we started with?
It's a profound counter-narrative, isn't it?
Yeah.
Here you have a community actively seeking space, innovating with scraps, battling bureaucracy just to create a thriving, human-centered place.
They have a demand for space.
An intense demand for functional, affordable space, and a willingness to pour immense labor into bringing it to life.
And the factories.
They stand in stark opposition. Often prime real estate, sitting vacant because they don't meet some specific profit threshold in the current market.
Use value versus exchange value again?
Exactly. The Ecovillage maximizes use value and social value. The empty zones highlight a market prioritizing exchange value and potential future profit, even at the cost of immediate social benefit.
It really makes you think, what if the Ecovillage could use those abandoned spaces?
Imagine the social and environmental benefits that could be unlocked. It really frames the absurdity of the situation differently.
Okay, let's pivot now to the more theoretical side of affordable housing. The second source gives us a framework for understanding what it takes for these projects to actually succeed on a larger scale.
Right.
We've seen the lived experience, the micro level with the Ecovillage. Now, what does the research say makes a difference for broader initiatives, maybe government-backed ones?
This section moves us from that specific on-the-ground example to the analytical tools that economists and project managers use to measure and understand housing initiatives.
Try to systematize it.
Exactly. The source highlights that studies show a clear relationship between the ends, the goals, the success criteria, and the means, the critical success factors for these projects.
Okay, so what are the ends we're aiming for with affordable housing?
Well, the source lists several. Satisfaction of all parties involved, that's key. Not just residents, but developers, government, the local community.
Everyone has a stake.
They do. Also, obviously, actually delivering affordable houses, ensuring quality housing, not just cheap structures, and doing it on time and within budget.
The practical outcomes.
The tangible benchmarks of success, yes.
And what about the means? What are the critical factors needed to achieve those ends?
Several are identified. Government guarantees are often crucial. They provide essential financial backing, reduce risk,
Make projects more attractive.
especially for private investment where profit margins might be thin. Then there's proper project identification and technical feasibility, making sure it's the right project, well-conceived, buildable, fitting the community.
Avoiding expensive mistakes.
Right. Competitive and transparent procurement processes are vital, too, for efficiency, preventing corruption, ensuring public funds are used well.
Good governance.
And finally, foundational things. A stable macroeconomic environment and efficient financial markets. Without stable inflation, reasonable interest rates, accessible loans,
The best plans fall apart.
they can. And this goes right to the heart of our urban contradiction, doesn't it? If these fundamental means aren't in place, achieving the end of widespread affordable housing becomes incredibly difficult, no matter how great the need.
It seems like they're even suggesting a mathematical way to measure all this. Something about a comprehensive index.
Yes, the source recommends developing an index using a mathematical model. The idea is to establish a clear relationship between the ends, which are the dependent variables,
The outcomes you want.
and the means, the independent variables, the factors you can influence at different stages of the project.
They mentioned a fuzzy synthetic evaluation model. Sounds complex.
It is a bit technical, but the core idea is insightful. Think about trying to quantify things like community satisfaction or aesthetic quality alongside hard numbers like budget adherence.
Difficult.
Very. Traditional models often struggle with those soft variables. Fuzzy logic allows researchers to incorporate that kind of ambiguity and subjective judgment into a quantifiable framework.
So it acknowledges success isn't just numbers.
Exactly. It acknowledges that success is also about how a project genuinely improves quality of life, how it fits into the urban fabric. It tries to quantify and optimize what are inherently social, human-centric outcomes.
giving a more holistic picture of success.
That's the goal. So when we see those vacant spaces, we can ask not just why aren't they profitable, but why aren't the means in place for them to achieve broader societal ends like housing?
Understanding this framework really highlights the complexity, doesn't it? Sustainable housing isn't just construction.
Not at all. It's finance, politics, social factors.
The whole ecosystem.
It really is. The policies, the market conditions, government's role, the transparency of it all, it's a holistic view of what it takes to build a thriving community.
Which makes just letting old factories sit empty because the numbers don't immediately add up seem, well, incredibly short-sighted.
It overlooks all those broader ends of societal well-being, yes.
Okay, let's dig into this next section, the history of economic thought. Now, this might seem a bit abstract, maybe far removed from vacant factories and displaced families.
Understandable first reaction.
But the source suggests it actually provides the foundational ideas, the concepts about society, wealth, value that have shaped our cities, maybe without us even realizing it.
This is where it gets really, really interesting, I think, because this source lets us connect the dots from ancient philosophers all the way to modern capitalism.
Revealing the assumptions underneath.
The deep-seated assumptions shaping our cities. Political economy, the study of how economies are managed in relation to political systems, is inherently a social science. It has this crucial historical dimension.
But there's a tension.
Yes. Economists often feel pressure to adopt methods from the natural sciences seeking logical consistency, like in physics. But if you disregard the social characteristics, the human element, you impoverish the understanding.
Because theory isn't tested in isolation.
Exactly. As the source says, no theory is ever tested in isolation, and theories can even be sort of immunized against refuting empirical evidence.
On the subject.
By tweaking assumptions, adding exceptions, it means economic models, while aiming for rigor, often abstract away the messy social reality.
Which can lead to outcomes like our urban paradox.
Precisely. Situations that define neat, logical solutions but are deeply rooted in social and historical contexts.
So going way back, before economics was really its own field, ideas were embedded in philosophy, right? Moral systems.
That's right. Part of broader ethical frameworks. William Petty, in the 17th century, was one of the first to really have explicit discussions about price, commodity, market.
Starting to quantify things.
Trying to put numbers to economic activity, yes.
But even further back, Aristotle.
Yes, back to the Greeks. Aristotle actually considered wealth gained purely from commerce, from trade, to be unnatural. He even condemned interest-bearing loans.
Wow, a very different mindset from today.
Completely different, where lending and interest are fundamental, yet he also supported private ownership, but with common use.
What does that mean?
His quote is something like, "It is better for possessions to be privately owned, but to make them common property in use."
So you own it, but others can benefit from it.
It's an ancient recognition of balancing individual ownership with collective benefit. Think about our vacant factories. Privately owned, yes. But Aristotle might ask if they could serve as common property in use, maybe for housing, community space, even while ownership stays private.
Challenges the idea of absolute private property rights.
It questions whether ownership confers absolute exclusive rights with no social obligation attached.
And later, Thomas Aquinas. More moderate on interest.
A bit more moderate, yes. He distinguished between condemned cases of usury and justified cases, especially if the lender incurred an actual loss or risk. It shows a gradual, cautious shift towards accommodating financial practices within an ethical framework.
Acknowledging they might be necessary.
Right. And William Petty, who you mentioned earlier, he really pushed the quantitative approach, coined political arithmetic.
Applying statistics to society.
Basically, yes. And his famous formula: labor is the father and active principle of wealth, as lands are the mother.
Highlighting labor and land
as the foundational sources of value, a concept that echoes through centuries of economic thought. He also distinguished natural price.
The optimal price.
The optimal price, best technology, efficient operation, from political price.
The actual price.
The actual price you see, influenced by real-world production conditions, market imperfections. His work even foreshadowed econometrics.
Applying stats to economic data.
Yes. And he considered the velocity of money circulation, too, showed an early grasp of monetary dynamics, and, interestingly, Petty was involved in the venture that founded Pennsylvania.
Applying these ideas in the real world.
Early economic engagement with new territories, seeing land and labor as the building blocks of wealth for a new society.
Okay, moving forward. The physiocrats. The first real school of economic thought.
First school with its own journals, centered around Francois Kissne, yeah. And they had a very specific core belief.
Agriculture is key.
Agriculture was the only sector that produced a surplus, a net product, a very narrow view of value creation compared to ours.
Why physiocrats?
Their name means rule of nature. They believed in a natural order inherent in things. An enlightened ruler's job was to implement this as positive order, which included defending private property.
And they classified society
Into three classes.
Yeah.
The productive class, agriculture, the sterile class, manufacturers, artisans, and the aristocratic class, landlords who consumed the surplus.
And the surplus only came from?
Only from agriculture, in their view. And that surplus regulated everything else. It shows an early, strong emphasis on land as the ultimate source of wealth.
A legacy that might still affect how land is valued today.
Quite possibly. Contributing perhaps to holding land vacant for speculation rather than immediate use.
Then comes the big one. Adam Smith. Changed the game.
Huge figure. He rejected arbitrary government power and also Hobbes's idea of society being purely a contract, which had led mercantilist theories to be very state-focused.
He wanted a different approach.
A third way to understand individuals and society. He made a crucial distinction between narrow selfishness and broader self-interest.
What's the difference?
For Smith, self-interest included sympathy, a concern for others' interests, a recognition of shared humanity. It's a nuance often lost today.
And the invisible hand.
His concept that individual actions, driven by this broader personal interest, could have positive effects on society overall, especially for the economy's functioning. But, and this is crucial, Smith did not say this guaranteed the optimality of a competitive market based just on supply and demand.
That's a common misinterpretation.
A very common one that came later. He saw it more as a general tendency, a subtle guiding force, not some perfect mechanism that automatically solves all problems.
He also distinguished natural price from market price.
Yes. Natural price was theoretical, based on production cost and ideal. Market price was empirical, messy, influenced by temporary factors like prices at a village fair.
He understood the real world wasn't perfect.
He did. And he linked the division of labor not just to efficiency, but to our innate social nature, our desire to truck, barter, and exchange, or even just differing abilities. It wasn't purely mechanical for him.
And he was quite forward-thinking on other issues.
Remarkably so for his time. Ready to recognize colonial rights, outlining a potential commonwealth for North America. His thinking was broad human nature, society, not just narrow economics. Finally, in this early period, we touched on Malthus.
The population guy.
Pessimistic.
Very pessimistic. His population principle argued wages always tend towards bare subsistence level.
Why?
Because if wages rose, people would have more children, population would grow, and increased labor supply would push wages back down. A bleak cycle of poverty.
But he was criticized.
By Smith, who thought bargaining power mattered more. And our source points out that time-lag population changes take time to affect labor markets. Plus, Malthus crucially underestimated technological progress, especially in agriculture.
Which allowed food production to outpace population growth.
Dramatically so in many parts of the world. History proved him overly pessimistic about human ingenuity, but his ideas about resource scarcity still cast a long shadow. So we've traced the path from early ideas about wealth and land to the foundations of classical economics with Smith. But things didn't stop there, right? How did economic thought evolve as societies industrialized? What new tensions came up?
Right. The thinking continued to evolve, often in response to new realities. And this next phase takes us through intellectual shifts that directly shaped our understanding of economic systems, including their inherent contradictions highly relevant to our urban paradox.
Like Marx.
Like Marx. He introduced the materialistic conception of history. He argued that how societies produce things, the economic structure forms the real foundation.
And everything else rests on top.
Legal systems, politics, culture, consciousness itself. Social existence determines consciousness, as he put it, not the other way around. This gives us a powerful lens. Maybe our urban paradox isn't an accident, but a direct result of our underlying economic system.
And central to his critique was alienated labor.
Absolutely. Where work stops being a fulfilling expression of human creativity and becomes just a means to survive, workers become alienated from the product, the process, each other, even their own human nature.
Just a cog in the machine.
That's the idea. And this leads directly to what he termed commodity fetishism.
Okay, what's that? Sounds strange.
In a market economy, Marx argued, the exchange of goods obscures the underlying social relations, the human collaboration involved. Commodities, things bought and sold, appear to have value in themselves, like magic fetishes.
Hiding the labor behind them.
Exactly. It hides the fact that exchanging goods is fundamentally about exchanging labor time and cooperation between people. The market's focus on abstract exchange value, the price tag diverts attention from the true end of social collaboration.
And how does this relate to the empty factory?
It's a perfect example. The empty factory, seen as a commodity on the real estate market, is fetishized. Its value is reduced to its potential exchange value, its price.
Obscuring its potential use value.
Obscuring its potential use value, the labor that built it, the community it supported, the social utility it could provide as housing or something else. It sits empty because its fetishized market value isn't deemed high enough, ignoring its real human value.
Marx also talked about the composition of capital.
Yes, the organic composition of capital, the ratio of investment in machinery and materials versus labor, and how that might relate to a tendency for the rate of profit to fall over time, creating internal pressures within capitalism.
Okay, then after Marx, a really big shift happened. The marginalist revolution.
A huge shift, a pivot in the fundamental question economists asked.
How so?
Classical economics, as we saw, focused on production, distribution, accumulation, how wealth is made and moved around. Marginalism changed the focus entirely.
To what?
To the optimal utilization of scarce resources to satisfy needs and desires. It reframes the core economic problem.
From how is wealth produced to how do we allocate scarce stuff efficiently?
Precisely. And this redefinition has profound implications for how we view everything, including urban development. Key figures here were Jevons, Menger, Marshall.
And they introduced the subjective theory of value.
Correct. Instead of value coming primarily from the labor or cost of production, they argued value derives from the consumer's subjective evaluation, specifically marginal utility.
The value of the next unit.
Yes. The value you get from consuming one more unit of something decreases as you consume more. The first slice of pizza is amazing. The 10th, not so much. That marginal value determines price.
Karl Menger from the Austrian school had a slightly different take.
He distinguished value, the essence, the human judgment, from price, the market phenomenon. His view of the economic agent involved evaluating needs and goods under uncertainty, and he didn't see needs as easily substitutable as other marginalists did. A bit more complex psychology.
And Alfred Marshall tried to bring things together.
Marshall attempted a synthesis. He tried to reconcile the classical focus on cost of production supply with the marginalist focus on subjective utility, demand, supply and demand determining price.
The famous scissors analogy.
Exactly. He also introduced different time frames for analysis, very short, long period, recognizing markets adjust at different speeds. And he had this evolutionary view of firms, like biological organisms with life cycles depending on entrepreneurial skill.
Did he see money as neutral?
Largely, yes, in the long run. He recognized liquidity could affect things in the short term, but mostly stuck to the classical view that money just facilitates transactions. It doesn't fundamentally change real economic outcomes over time.
But then Keynes came along and blew that up.
Keynes definitely shook things up, especially in response to the Great Depression. His ideas were revolutionary for 20th century macroeconomics.
Arguing money is not neutral.
Fundamentally not neutral. He argued money management should aim for internal price stability, recognizing conflicts of interest. He strongly opposed simple laissez-faire, just letting markets be.
Why? Because they don't self-correct.
He believed they didn't reliably self-correct to full employment. His crucial idea: decisions made by businesses about production levels aren't automatically consistent with using all available resources.
So you can get stuck.
You can get stuck in equilibriums with persistent unemployment. Market economies lack reliable automatic mechanisms to always reach full employment. This was radical.
Challenging that marginalist idea of optimal resource allocation.
Directly. It suggests that even a functioning market can leave resources, labor, capital, and crucially for us, land and buildings idle.
So if markets don't fix themselves, what did Keynes propose?
Active economic management. Using monetary policy, interest rates, money supply, and fiscal policy, especially government spending, to manage the economy, smooth out cycles, and push towards fuller employment.
Government intervention.
Yes, a strong belief in the necessity of government intervention. He also introduced the speculative demand for money.
Holding money just in case. Or to bet on future prices.
Exactly. People might hold money rather than investing it, depending on their expectations about future interest rates or asset prices. This separated saving decisions from investment decisions in a new way, making interest rates more complex than just balancing saving and investment.
Which could affect whether money flows into productive things like development.
Absolutely. If money is being held for speculation, it's not being invested productively, potentially contributing to idle resources like our vacant factories.
Another major 20th century thinker, Schumpeter. Creative destruction.
Schumpeter, yes. His methodological liberalism stressed that you need both abstract theory and historical context to understand economic phenomena. You can't grasp why factories close just with models. You need history, sociology,
And creative destruction.
his most famous concept. He linked business cycles to waves of innovation. Entrepreneurs innovate, imitators follow, banks finance this with credit, causing temporary inflation, but then...
The destruction part.
Right. As loans are repaid and new technologies displace old ones, firms clinging to old methods go bankrupt. New industries rise, old ones fall. He saw this as the essential, dynamic, if sometimes painful, engine of capitalist progress.
But he also saw a problem.
A deep contradiction. Capitalism requires this incessant change for economic stability, but that very change creates political and social instability. He actually predicted that capitalism's success might eventually lead to conditions that make its breakdown inevitable.
So applying that lens to our factories, are they casualties of creative destruction?
Possibly, remnants of industries destroyed by innovation. But the question then becomes, where is the creative part for the space and the people left behind? Is the destruction happening, but the creation failing to address the social fallout?
It seems incomplete.
It can feel that way.
And finally, Straffa. He challenged fundamental assumptions too.
Straffa did, from a different angle. His work is really vital for seeing the limits of abstract models when applied to the real world, especially for complex things like land and property.
How so?
He showed, for instance, that there isn't one single natural rate of interest guiding everything. In a complex world with many goods and time periods, there are potentially many natural rates. Undermines the idea of a simple guiding price for capital.
And he focused on interdependence.
Yes, the interdependence of prices and distribution. He argued that when goods are both inputs and outputs, like steel, you can't determine one price independently of others.
Okay.
And more radically, you can't determine relative prices independently of how income is distributed between wages and profits. You have to look at the whole system.
So the price of that factory isn't isolated.
It's linked to wages, profits across the economy, how the pie is divided, not just supply and demand for that specific building. He also critiqued core assumptions of standard models like perfect market clearing, no trading at wrong prices, perfectly rational consumers, smooth production possibilities as clearly unrealistic.
Too neat for the real world.
Far too neat. And maybe his most crucial point for us. Straffa stressed that economic outcomes reflect not just technical production issues, but also institutions, customs, and social structure.
The rules of the game.
Exactly. The unwritten rules, the power structures, the historical context, these govern the web of exchanges. He distinguished between a core of analysis where you can find stable quantitative relations and another field, likely including things like social norms influencing wages or land use where relations are too complex and variable for such neat models.
So understanding our urban contradiction means looking beyond pure economics.
It means looking at the embedded social and institutional rules of the game that dictate who owns what, who benefits, and how value itself is defined and measured in our society. Empty factories aren't just market blips. They're symptoms of these deeper structures.
Wait, we started this deep dive with that really stark image.
Yeah.
Vacant industrial buildings right next to families being displaced from their homes.
Mm-hmm. The core contradiction.
Now that we've journeyed through the Ecovillage's practical struggles and this vast history of economic thought, how do these complex, sometimes abstract theories actually help us understand that specific, painful reality on the ground?
Well, the journey through these frameworks gives us powerful lenses, doesn't it? The Ecovillage showed us practical alternative and the friction involved. Now we can bring it all together.
Right.
That very existence of vacant industrial spaces right alongside housing crises, it directly challenges that marginalist view of optimal utilization of scarce available resources.
If land is scarce and housing needed, why isn't it being used?
Exactly. Why isn't this supposedly scarce urban land being optimally used for housing, especially affordable housing? It's a fundamental question that makes you doubt whether the market, left alone, truly optimizes for overall societal well-being.
Could it be Schumpeter's creative destruction playing out?
It could be. Old industrial structures become obsolete.
The destruction part.
But the destruction also harms communities by displacing them, maybe without a corresponding creative reuse of the space that serves those communities. Is it a symptom of that political instability Schumpeter worried about, where economic dynamism creates social disruption that isn't adequately managed?
And thinking about value. Petty's distinction.
Between natural price, optimal societal benefit, and political price, actual market price. Is the political price of that vacant land maybe inflated by speculation or zoning hopes, preventing its use for housing, even if its natural price, its best use for society, points that way?
A disconnect between market logic and social good.
A fundamental disconnect. And think back even further, those ancient condemnations of wealth from pure commerce or interest by thinkers like Aristotle. How do they resonate today with concerns about speculation and profit-driven development that leaves buildings empty while people need homes?
Suggests this tension isn't new.
Not at all. This tension between profit motive and human needs seems deeply ingrained in how we've thought about wealth for centuries.
And Marx's idea of commodity fetishism really seemed to land earlier.
It's a potent explanation here. Does the market's focus on the abstract exchange value of these vacant properties obscure the underlying social collaboration needed or the community's need for housing and space?
Seeing the building only as an asset number.
When it's seen primarily as an asset for speculative gain, its true social value, the labor embedded in it, the community it represents, its potential for human flourishing, gets obscured, fetishized.
And his broader idea about the economic structure.
His materialistic conception is the economic structure of society, creating these contradictions. Are the material forces of production, like land development trends, industrial decline, coming into conflict with the existing relations of production, like who owns the land, who profits, and crucially, who gets displaced? Marx's framework suggests this isn't an accident, it's a systemic outcome.
It really feels like understanding these deeper economic currents is essential if we want real solutions, not just Band-Aids. It's about more than just building a few houses here and there.
Precisely. It shifts the discussion from just observing the contradiction to understanding why it's so persistent. And importantly, what kinds of interventions different theoretical stances might suggest.
Like that framework for affordable housing success.
Yes, from Quofi and colleagues. It reminds us success depends on those identified means. Government guarantees, transparent procurement, stable macroeconomy. Our urban contradictions strongly suggest those means are misaligned, insufficient, or maybe even actively working against the goal of affordable housing in these specific contexts.
If the underlying conditions aren't right.
Even well-intentioned projects will struggle. If land is tied up by speculators, for example, technical feasibility studies don't matter much for affordability.
And bridging theory and lived experience, the Ecovillage model.
Their reliance on both internal practices and external social services highlights that interdependence ideology. It contrasts sharply with traditional rugged individualism.
And directly addresses those constraints.
Constraints like insecure financial situations and lack of geographical space, the very issues driving displacement elsewhere. It suggests solutions might lie in more communal, integrated approaches, not purely individualistic ones. Maybe we need to rethink self-reliance in dense urban settings. And this loops back beautifully to Sraffa.
His emphasis on institutions.
His emphasis on institutions, customs, and social structure governing economic relations. The rules of the game in urban development aren't just pure market forces. They're embedded in societal structures, laws, norms, power dynamics that might favor certain outcomes, vacant land, displacement over others, affordable housing, community stability.
We're operating within a system whose rules shape the outcome.
Exactly. And those rules aren't just about abstract supply and demand. They're about power, history, deeply ingrained social beliefs about property and wealth.
So maybe even Adam Smith's optimism needs a second look here. His view of personal interest leading to collective progress.
Could this specific outcome, vacant spaces, displaced people, be an unintended consequence when self-interest drifts into unchecked selfishness? Or when the invisible hand is misinterpreted as guaranteeing optimality in all situations, even when it clearly isn't delivering desirable social outcomes?
That's a critical question.
It is. And how might Keynes' call for active economic management apply? Could public expenditure, for instance, be used to address the implicit unemployment of these underutilized urban spaces and the social costs of displacement?
Government stepping in to repurpose them.
Could public investment convert what the market deems unprofitable into socially beneficial assets, moving towards a more desirable equilibrium where resources are actually used for human well-being? These different economic lenses don't just describe the problem, they point towards different potential solutions, forcing us to ask if the current equilibrium is really acceptable.
Wow. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the very practical, lived reality of that urban eco-village, through the structured analysis of what makes affordable housing projects work, the means and ends.
And deep into the history of economic thought itself, Aristotle, Smith, Marx, Keynes, Schumpeter, quite the journey.
It really shows how theory and reality intertwine, doesn't it? Revealing the layers beneath what we often just see on the surface.
And what seems clear, I think, is that this contradiction of vacant urban spaces right next to displaced families, it's not just a logistical hiccup.
No, it's much more than that.
It feels like a profound symptom, a symptom of this complex interplay between deeply rooted economic theories, decades of policy choices, and our evolving social structures.
It's a reflection of how we as a society have chosen, consciously or unconsciously, to define and organize value, wealth, and land.
So our deep dive today, launching Ethical Root, has really shown that these big questions, affordable housing, financial independence, sustainable living, they're not separate issues. They are woven into the very fabric of how we think economically.
Absolutely.
And understanding why our cities grapple with these strange contradictions requires us to question the foundations, doesn't it? Not just tinker with the symptoms. Question the very foundations of our current economic and social systems. How are they working? Who are they working for?
It pushes us to consider how our definitions of value, wealth, progress definitions shaped over centuries, how they actually manifest in the physical places and social landscapes of our cities today.
Are we valuing the right things? And are systems truly designed to deliver on those values for all members of society, or just some?
So for you, our listener, here's maybe a final thought to chew on as we wrap up. If, as someone like Schumpeter suggests, our economic lives are fundamentally governed not just by abstract models, but by institutions, customs, and social structure,
The rules of the game.
then what specific rules of the game must we as a society critically examine? What rules might we need to reshape if we truly want to bridge this divide between empty spaces and people in need right here in our own communities? What stands out to you from today's deep dive?
A crucial question to ponder.
Thank you so much for joining us on this inaugural deep dive into Ethical Root. We really look forward to continuing this crucial conversation with you.